In early August 1944, at the Allied headquarters in Normandy, General Dwight D. Eisenhower stood silently at his desk, frowning as he read an urgent telegram that had just arrived. The sender was none other than British Prime Minister Winston Churchill. Its contents gave the Supreme Allied commander pause. Churchill was earnestly requesting a postponement of the long-planned landing in southern France. Instead, he urged that Allied forces be redirected toward the Balkans, a strategic region Britain had long regarded as vital. As Eisenhower read line by line, he gradually grasped a deeper truth. Churchill was attempting to steer the entire Allied war machine according to Britain's own political calculations, maneuvers that had quietly shaped Allied strategy for years. This was not the first time the American general had seen the British Prime Minister try to bend joint military plans to serve London's interests. But at this moment, faced with a plea that was urgent yet deeply calculated, Eisenhower understood that he would have to confront that political pressure head-on or risk seeing the war veer off its essential course. Rewind the clock 2 years to 1942, when the United States had just entered World War II. At that time, Eisenhower was still a colonel, not yet the five-star general he would later become. He was sent to London to join the Anglo-American Combined Command. Almost immediately, he found himself witnessing fierce debates between British and American leaders over how to strike Nazi Germany. The American side, led by General George C. Marshall, pressed hard for an immediate cross-channel invasion of France, a direct blow at the enemy's heart to liberate Europe as quickly as possible. Churchill and the British chiefs of staff, however, firmly opposed the idea. The traumatic memories of the Somme and Passchendaele from World War I still haunted British military thinking. They feared that an early assault across the English Channel would turn into another catastrophic slaughter against German defenses. They also harbored doubts about the combat readiness of the still inexperienced U.S. Army. Instead of a direct invasion, Churchill proposed a different approach, a strategy of peripheral warfare, striking at the weaker edges of the Axis empire. His first target was North Africa, which he described as the soft underbelly of the fascist powers. In Churchill's view, Britain and the United States should first drive German and Italian forces out of North Africa, secure control of the Mediterranean, and only then gradually tighten the noose around continental Europe. This proposal deeply frustrated American generals. Many bluntly argued that London was drawing Washington into a sideshow war designed to protect Britain's imperial interests. In reality, North Africa and the Mediterranean were the lifelines of the British Empire, linking the Suez Canal to the Indian Ocean. From Washington's perspective, committing U.S. forces there amounted to turning American soldiers into pawns on Britain's geopolitical chessboard. Yet Churchill was a masterful and determined statesman. In June 1942, he personally crossed the Atlantic to meet President Franklin D. Roosevelt. Through eloquent persuasion and dire warnings about the Mediterranean situation, Churchill won the president over. Despite strong, but ultimately ineffective, opposition from the U.S. Joint Chiefs of Staff, Roosevelt agreed to postpone a French invasion. Instead, he authorized a North African offensive, codenamed Operation Torch, scheduled for late 1942. With this decision, Roosevelt hoped both to preserve Allied unity and to secure a tangible victory that would reassure the American public ahead of the November midterm elections. Eisenhower, then just 52 years old, was appointed commander of Operation Torch. Virtually overnight, he rose from a staff officer with no direct combat command experience to the leader of a massive Anglo-American expeditionary force aimed at the Axis stronghold in North Africa. On November 8, 1942, more than 100,000 Allied troops, most of them inexperienced American soldiers, stormed ashore in Morocco and Algeria under Eisenhower's command. Thanks to careful organization and overwhelming logistical superiority, Operation Torch unfolded successfully. Within months, German and Italian forces in Tunisia were trapped, and by May 1943, all of North Africa had been liberated. It marked the first major American victory on the European front, a strategically significant triumph that secured Mediterranean supply routes and provided a springboard for further operations into southern Europe. Yet beneath the glow of victory, unease lingered between the two allies. American generals understood that the North African campaign had delayed a direct assault on the belly of Germany by nearly a full year. And just as they feared, Churchill showed no intention of stopping there. He immediately pushed for the next operation, an invasion of Sicily, Operation Husky, another step in his peripheral strategy. In January 1943, at the Casablanca Conference in Morocco, Roosevelt once again yielded to Churchill. The Allies agreed not to launch a cross-channel invasion in 1943, but instead to seize Sicily once North Africa was fully secured. Roosevelt accepted the plan in the hope that knocking Italy out of the war would rapidly weaken the Axis and pave the way for a later invasion of France. Churchill, for his part, was exuberant. He famously described Italy as the soft underbelly of Europe, a place where a single decisive thrust could cause the Axis defenses to unravel from the south. In the summer of 1943, Eisenhower was once again entrusted with supreme command, this time as overall commander of Operation Husky, the Allied invasion of Sicily. Under close Anglo-American coordination, the island fell after just 6 weeks of intense fighting, leading directly to the collapse of fascist Italy's regime in September 1943. For the British, this was a moment of satisfaction. In less than a year, Churchill's Mediterranean strategy had produced what he called great results, just as he had so forcefully argued to the Americans. Italy surrendered, the Mediterranean sea lanes were secured. On the military chessboard, these were undeniable victories. Yet from Washington's perspective, the most critical issue remained unresolved. Germany still occupied most of Western Europe, and the long-promised Second Front in France showed no clear sign of becoming reality. By mid-1943, tensions between British and American planners were beginning to surface openly. U.S. leaders feared that continued focus on the Mediterranean would only give Germany more time to strengthen its so-called Fortress Europe. Churchill and the British High Command, however, showed little desire to abandon the newly won Italian campaign. They urged the Americans to continue pushing up the Italian peninsula, capture Rome, then press northward. Officially, the goal was to eliminate fascist Italy completely, but beneath that objective lay longer-term calculations. If British forces advanced far enough into northeastern Italy, they could potentially move into the Balkans via the Adriatic, extending British influence across southeastern Europe in the post-war order. To avoid appearing overtly self-interested, Churchill argued that opening a Balkan front would draw German forces away from the Eastern Front, thereby indirectly assisting the Soviet Union. Yet behind this military rationale was a carefully crafted diplomatic move. If the Allies entered the Balkans from Italy, Britain would gain a decisive advantage in shaping the region's post-war future. In Washington, President Roosevelt and General George C. Marshall increasingly recognized the growing divergence in ultimate war aims. The Americans wanted to defeat Nazi Germany as quickly as possible so they could redirect their full strength against Japan. The British, by contrast, favored prolonging the war along peripheral fronts where they could maximize geopolitical returns, preserving imperial interests and securing leverage in Eastern Europe. The White House concluded that the time had come to rein in Churchill's strategic agenda. At the Quebec Conference in Canada in August 1943, Roosevelt firmly set the timetable for opening a front in northern France in the spring of 1944, Operation Overlord, and demanded Britain's commitment. This marked the first time Churchill was forced to accept a fixed deadline for a plan he had long sought to delay. Though deeply reluctant, the British Prime Minister could not openly oppose his most important ally. especially as Roosevelt invoked mounting pressure from the Soviet Union. In reality, Joseph Stalin had repeatedly grown impatient, even sending blunt messages to London and Washington demanding the opening of the Second Front. Churchill understood that continued delay risked shattering Moscow's trust in Britain altogether. That reality became unavoidable at the Tehran Conference in November 1943, where the Big Three, Roosevelt, Churchill, and Stalin, met face to face. There, Stalin bluntly demanded that Britain and the United States honor their promise to open the French front the following year. Roosevelt fully aligned with the Soviet position. Cornered and with no room left to maneuver, Churchill was compelled to accept Operation Overlord, scheduled for May 1944. Stalin went further, skillfully pressing the Allies to approve an additional coordinated landing in southern France to create a pincer against German forces. Though Churchill outwardly agreed to the collective decision, he left Tehran deeply dispirited. He knew that strategic initiative had now passed decisively into American and Soviet hands. In later years, Churchill bitterly reflected, "If only I had managed to sway Stalin." But the American president was far too heavily influenced by his generals, and as a result, all the glorious opportunities in the Mediterranean were swept aside. His lament revealed how deeply he still clung to his Eastern options, the Balkans and the Mediterranean, even as Tehran marked the definitive failure of those ambitions. Ironically, it was at Tehran that Eisenhower, once the executor of Churchill's Mediterranean strategy, was entrusted with the greatest command of his career. On December 7, 1943, President Roosevelt officially appointed Eisenhower Supreme Commander of Operation Overlord, tasking him with preparing the invasion that would liberate France. Leaving the Italian theater behind, Ike flew to Britain and immediately began work on the most audacious plan of the war, D-Day, the day of decision in Normandy. The burden placed upon the American general was immense, and he knew success depended on preserving Allied unity. Eisenhower proved deft in that role. He maintained a close personal relationship with Churchill, while working closely with senior British commanders such as Alan Brooke and Bernard Montgomery. In his memoirs, Eisenhower described Churchill as an inspiring leader, a master orator who fiercely defended his own views. On many occasions, Churchill spoke to Ike for hours at a time, quoting everything from Greek mythology to, remarkably, Donald Duck, all in an effort to persuade the American general of a particular idea. Eisenhower later admitted, "I admired and liked him greatly. Churchill knew this perfectly well and did not hesitate to use that affection to try to draw me to his side in arguments." The mutual respect and personal warmth between the two men were genuine, but they could not conceal the strategic conflict that was rapidly approaching its decisive moment. The early months of 1944 became a major test for both Eisenhower and Churchill. Officially, Britain and the United States had committed to concentrating all their strength on Operation Overlord. Behind the scenes, however, Churchill and the British chiefs of staff still hoped to adjust the plan at the last moment. They feared that a direct landing in Normandy would result in enormous casualties, and therefore sought to exploit every peripheral opportunity before D-Day arrived. Churchill made no secret of his wish. If possible, he wanted to delay Overlord by several months in order to carry out additional side operations. In February 1944, only a few months before D-Day, the British Prime Minister was still venting his frustration, asking bluntly, "Why do we have to do this?" referring to the Normandy invasion. As the decisive moment drew closer, Churchill continued to bombard his subordinates and allies with a stream of alternative proposals, invading Norway, stabilizing the Balkans, even launching an attack on Portugal. This constant flow of indirect schemes not only infuriated American commanders, but also wore down some British officers. Sir Alan Brooke, Britain's chief of the Imperial General Staff, admitted candidly, "If we had followed his ideas, there would certainly have been no invasion of France in 1944. Clearly, Churchill and his staff still favored a strategy of gradual attrition, bleeding the German army on multiple fronts before delivering a final blow. The Americans, led by Eisenhower, believed instead in the Clausewitzian principle of concentrating overwhelming force at the decisive point. These two nearly opposing philosophies of war clashed violently throughout the first half of 1944 as plans for the liberation of Europe entered their final phase. Within this broader conflict, one concrete dispute rose to the surface. Operation Anvil, the planned landing in southern France designed to support Overlord. The idea of opening a second landing in Provence had originally been proposed by Stalin at Tehran, with the aim of drawing German forces away from Normandy. The Americans quickly embraced it, seeing an opportunity to open vital supply routes from the Mediterranean and to squeeze Germany from two directions. Eisenhower regarded Anvil as an essential parallel killing blow that would accelerate the liberation of all France. Churchill, however, detested the plan. To him, Anvil meant abandoning the golden opportunities of the Mediterranean, especially further advances into the Balkans or the consolidation of British control over Greece. He argued forcefully that France required only one main thrust from Normandy, while the remaining resources should be directed against the soft Balkan underbelly of Europe. Churchill's deeper motive was transparent. If Anglo-American forces did not land in southern France, they could move into southeastern Europe ahead of the Soviet Red Army. This, in essence, was the core of Churchill's political calculation, using military operations to block Soviet influence and safeguard British interests in the post-war settlement. By the spring of 1944, the Anglo-American struggle over Operation Anvil had become almost as intense as the fighting at the front. In April, Churchill met privately with U.S. General Mark W. Clark, commander of the Fifth Army in Italy, and tried to persuade him to support abandoning Anvil in favor of concentrating forces in Italy and the Balkans. According to memoirs, Churchill even declared, "If I were planning Overlord, I would not undertake it until we had retaken Norway, cleared the Germans from the Aegean, and persuaded Turkey to enter the war." These preconditions were plainly unrealistic, meaning that, under Churchill's logic, D-Day might have been postponed indefinitely. Despite his personal respect for the British Prime Minister, Eisenhower could not accept such an open-ended scenario. He remained firm in his conviction that Overlord must take absolute priority and that all other operations were secondary. The Overlord versus Balkans debate dragged on relentlessly, forcing Roosevelt and Churchill to exchange numerous confidential messages. In the end, the American president stated his position unequivocally. Overlord and Anvil were the two critical operations of 1944, and no other theater was permitted to interfere with them. Faced with clear direction from Washington, Churchill reluctantly agreed to proceed with Anvil. Though privately he continued to hope that a ripe moment would emerge to cancel it at the last possible moment. On June 6, 1944, Operation D-Day was launched. Under Eisenhower's command, the Allied forces struck a thunderous blow against Hitler's Atlantic Wall. The Normandy landings were a resounding success, establishing a bridgehead that allowed more than 1 million Allied troops to pour into France. Despite his deep private anxieties, Churchill was compelled to acknowledge that this was the most decisive battle of the entire war. At the same time, on the Italian front, Allied forces captured Rome on June 4, 1944, and continued pursuing German units retreating northward. These successive victories seemed to settle all strategic debates, but not for Churchill. He viewed the fall of Rome as an opportunity to turn the board over. In his view, if the southern France landing were canceled and all forces concentrated on an advance from Italy, Anglo-American armies could cross the Alps and strike toward Vienna or Budapest before the Soviet Red Army arrived. Churchill described this as a plan to stab into the heart of Europe from the rear. On the political chessboard, however, Stalin had pledged to launch a major offensive on the Eastern Front concurrently with an Allied landing in southern France. If Britain and the United States reneged and canceled Operation Anvil, Allied credibility would suffer a severe blow, giving Moscow grounds to suspect that the Western Allies were engaging in their own calculations with Hitler. Fully aware of these consequences, President Roosevelt chose to adhere to the agreed course. Preparations for Anvil, now renamed Operation Dragoon, would continue with execution set for mid-August 1944. In late July 1944, just as U.S. forces broke through German defenses at Saint-Lô in northern France, Churchill made a final attempt to block Dragoon. He immediately sent a telegram to Washington proposing the cancellation of the southern France operation, urging instead a massive reinforcement of the Italian front and a possible push into the Balkans. He even enlisted Harry Hopkins, Roosevelt's close advisor, to help persuade the American president to reverse course. This time, however, Roosevelt listened to his generals rather than the persuasive appeals of his old British friend. He replied bluntly that all agreements reached at Tehran must be honored. Overlord and Dragoon were joint strategic priorities, and no party was free to alter them unilaterally. As at the beginning of the story, Eisenhower stood at the center of the pressure from Churchill. After D-Day, Ike had moved his headquarters to France to direct operations on the Western Front personally. On August 4, 1944, he received a top-secret telegram from the British Prime Minister. In it, Churchill argued that Allied forces were winning decisively in Normandy and that Dragoon was no longer essential. Instead, resources should be concentrated on finishing the Italian campaign quickly and then, if possible, striking into the Balkans before the Red Army arrived. As he read the message, Eisenhower immediately grasped its underlying intent, a last-ditch effort to secure geopolitical advantage for Britain. Ike was no stranger to such calculations. Over the previous 2 years, he had repeatedly witnessed British leaders placing political objectives above the shared strategic interests of the alliance. But this time was different. For the first time, Eisenhower found himself in a position to say no. If he yielded, the Allied plan for decisive victory risked derailing. If he stood firm, he knew he had the backing of Washington and Moscow as well. Eisenhower took a deep breath and picked up his pen to draft his reply. His message was courteous yet resolute. He stated that unless the British Prime Minister and the American President jointly and openly decided to place political considerations above military necessity, he would not alter the operational plan for reasons that lay outside purely military judgment. In effect, Eisenhower delivered a clear message to Churchill. If Dragoon was to be canceled, it must be done openly by political authority. As the military commander, he would not voluntarily abandon a necessary operation simply to serve political aims. Eisenhower's reply amounted to an ultimatum. Churchill understood that he could not sway Ike without Roosevelt's backing, support he had failed to secure. In the end, the British Prime Minister was forced to back down. On August 10, 1944, the British Chiefs of Staff issued orders to General Wilson in the Mediterranean to proceed with Operation Dragoon exactly as planned. 4 days later, more than 400,000 Allied troops surged ashore along the southern coast of France. Operation Dragoon, launched on August 15, 1944, unfolded with a speed and success that exceeded all expectations. Within just a few weeks, Eisenhower's forces swept across southern France, liberating Marseille and Toulon, two ports of critical importance that dramatically accelerated the Allied supply effort on the Western Front. By September 1944, the two Allied spearheads, one advancing from Normandy in the north and the other from Provence in the south, had joined forces, opening the way for a rapid, thunderous advance toward Germany's borders. Looking back, Eisenhower later stated unequivocally, "Throughout that entire period, no development contributed more decisively to our ultimate victory than the subsidiary thrust up the Rhone Valley." That assessment revealed Ike's unshakable confidence in his decision to adhere to a strategy of concentrated force, maintained to the end. despite all the allure of the glamorous secondary fronts that Churchill had so often championed.